Hello guys, Bogdan Bratis from SaaSpot here. Welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're gonna talk about something really important, something that could make or break your podcast. And no kidding, I've seen podcasts that have done this wrong and they weren't able to grow, and that's a shame because you invest so much money into your podcast, and if you do this little mistake, the entire work goes down the drain. So we don't want that to happen. And also, if you do this incorrectly, you could even get into legal issues, and I've heard some horror stories that I will tell you about in this episode, so stick around because you really don't want that to happen to you, especially since you invested so much money into your podcast and then you also grew your podcast to, let's say, 100,000 people listening to you. You don't want that to happen, and I'll make sure that I'll give you all the right information for you to avoid that. I'm not a legal expert, but I'll give you all the best practices to avoid that as much as possible. Now, what we're going to talk about today, obviously you know it from the title and from the thumbnail, we're going to learn about how to name a podcast correctly. Now, what are the downsides of naming a podcast incorrectly? One thing is that a bad name for a podcast can hinder visibility. You won't be able to show up in Apple Podcasts, in Spotify, in YouTube. People will have trouble finding you. And you want to make your podcast as easy as possible to find online. And the name of your podcast is one of the things that makes that possible. The second part, like I mentioned before, is the legality of your podcast name or any type of name on the planet. You need to ensure that you have the right to use it, and then also you want to make sure that there's no competition on that name, and it's really easy for you to build your brand. There's free brand real estate for you to build on, and that's what we're also going to look into. And then the third one is that a podcast name is the core of your brand. So you don't want to miss on opportunities on increasing your company or your personal brand through the podcast name. Okay, now, first thing first, visibility issues. There are certain issues you're gonna get into if you don't name your podcast correctly, right? One of them is the visibility. For example, we need to make the distinction between a podcast name and a podcast title. The podcast name, it could be unique. It's something that you created and you came up with, and doesn't necessarily contain a keyword. That's fine. That's completely okay to have that. What I would advise is to, if you can, create a podcast name that contains the keyword itself. So for example, if you are into content marketing, you could say something like Content Marketing Unlocked. If you could come up with a name like that, it is more likely that that name will actually show up in Apple Podcasts when you write content marketing in Apple Podcasts, and I'm going to show you how that works in a few seconds. And then the podcast title is the title you put into the host, right? So for example, you sign up with SaaSpot and then you have a place there to put your podcast title, podcast name. We call it podcast name, podcast title. It doesn't matter what it is, but you could actually put there more than just your name, because many people forget that is just a field to actually input data into, and you could have your podcast name in there plus something else that could give you more exposure, and I'm going to show you how that works in a few seconds. So let's go straight into it. First thing first, let's go to Apple Podcasts, one of the main places where people look for podcasts. So as you can see, I'm in the Great Britain version, so the UK version on Apple Podcasts. Now these, depending on what country code you put in here, you'll get a different version of Apple Podcast in here. But I'm going to look in the UK here. It doesn't really matter for this video, but just so you understand, your podcast will show differently in different countries. So you want to do a bit of research in multiple countries to see where you actually rank with your podcast. So for example, you could say here, content marketing, and looking in here, you see the pod files. Now, the pod files wasn't in this list of podcasts that are listed as being relevant to this keyword. And what I did, I created a title, I created more or less a description of my podcast that has a bit of a tagline feel to it. And I said, the pod files, a content marketing podcast in a creator economy world. Now, there are two keywords here that I use. One is content marketing and the other one is creator economy. So content marketing, creator economy. As you can see, this one ranks even higher because there's less competition. How did I come up with these words, right? Why I chose content marketing, why I chose creator economy. Obviously, these two keywords are relevant to the subject of my podcast. So when people will click on my podcast, they will be able to listen things that are related to those keywords, because that's what the podcast is all about. But it's really important how you actually write those keywords, because you may think that a keyword may, people may look for it, but it's maybe just in your head. Maybe people aren't actually interested in that subject. So you want to do some research to see which keywords are the ones that really matter. So for that, you can use a tool like Ahrefs, for example. Now this one analyzes keywords for Google, right? It has nothing to do with Apple Podcasts, but you can get a good idea, what people are searching for on Apple. So for example, we write here content marketing, and you see that there's like 67,000 searches a month and the traffic potential is just huge. However, it is extremely hard to rank with this keyword on Google. So if I write, for example, a blog article on this keyword, it will have a hard time ranking on Google, because as you can see, you need about 800 backlinks for your article to actually rank. So it's extremely difficult, and you compete with loads of big fish in here, which unfortunately, I would say it's almost impossible for you at this stage to rank on this, unless you don't do loads of SEO and pump a lot of money. You cannot do it. But on Apple Podcasts, that's a different search engine, and is not as competitive. People are still looking for information in there, and it would be a good idea to actually rank in Apple Podcasts itself or in Spotify, because if you rank on Apple Podcasts, you're more likely rank in Spotify as well. So you want to make sure that you use, it doesn't matter if this keyword is difficult, you can use a difficult keyword, because on Apple Podcasts, that keyword is not difficult, right? But you get an idea of the volume and the traffic potential. So how many people are searching for this query every single month? And that is really powerful. So content marketing and creator economy. Another one. This one is slightly easier to rank on Google if you want, but it doesn't matter because we are using this onto the Apple Podcast strategy, right? So you could do that for Apple Podcasts, and what you need to do is go in SaaSpot, for example, if you use SaaSpot for hosting, which I will recommend you use, and then you want to make sure that you edit your podcast in here, and then you write the name of your podcast in here, plus an extension of that name. That's really gonna help you out. If you have a better name, say Content Marketing Unlocked, and it's not taken, for example, good for you, take that and do it. You also want to make sure that these keywords are found in the description of your podcast for that to work. So, for example, content marketing, it's it's mentioned twice in this, and then also creator economy. It's mentioned twice again. So that's really important. If you could also mention those keywords into episodes, and then if you could ask some of your friends to give you a few reviews for your podcast, for example, on Apple Podcasts, where they mention these keywords, it will really help the algorithm to actually recommend you for this specific query. Another thing that I would like to talk about is the legality part of your name. So if you don't name your podcast correctly, you can get into legal issues. And something like that happened to a client of mine where they named their podcast in a certain way. I won't say exactly what the name is because I don't want to disclose that information, but they had the name of the podcast, they ran 100 episodes, and then they got a letter from Disney which told them, look, you cannot use this name, you need to change your name. And Disney is a huge company, it's a huge content company. You cannot battle with that. And since they got that letter, they had to change it. They even got a YouTube channel banned, which was quite a shame. And they came to me with their podcast name already figured out. They already launched the podcast. We just provided post-production services to them. But they never gave their name a second thought, and their podcast failed because of that, unfortunately. Now, you don't want that to happen to you. And what you want to do is do some research on your podcast name. So for example, I'm going to show you a few websites where you could go and you can check for those issues. One is the USPTO, which is a United States one. So you go here and then you can search for trademarks. For example, trademarks, you go here and then you can search for the trademark on this website. Another one, which I used a little bit because I think it's very powerful because it covers the entire European Union. You can go and search for names, logos, anything like that. You want to make sure that it's not taken. So for example, I have my own trademark registered here, and that's on Bratis, which is my artist name. And if you go around here, somewhere will be available here, right? So that's my own trademark, and you can register that for 10 years, for example, and nobody can touch it for 10 years in a specific class. So classification, for example, somebody could use this into, let's say, selling jewelry, but they could not use this in music, for example, because that's a different class. So you could buy your name, the podcast name, into a class that is specific to podcasting or to entertainment or to media. And you can do that. You can do that also on the UK government website. You can fill in a trademark in here if you want to. This will cover just the UK. Now, you could start this with the UK, for example. I'm not sure exactly how much it costs now, but I remember it used to cost like £200 to fill in a trademark. And then you can go to fill one with Europe and another one in the US. And then you're pretty much covered. However, you're not covered, for example, in Africa or Asia. I'm not a legal expert, but the more coverage you have on your name, the more power you have, right? And £200, it's not a big investment, and then you pay a little bit more in Europe. For example, when I filled in my application was 800 euros, and then I'm not sure exactly how much is in the US, but you spend money for production anyway. It would be a good idea to do this investment just so you protect your work. Now, you could use those websites to research if your name is already taken or not. So that's already a benefit. And then you can start creating content with that name and then you can trademark it later on. But at least you're not infringing on anybody's trademark, which is very important. Another thing you want to check is if the domain is available, and one of the best places to look for that is GoDaddy.com or Namecheap or Domain.com. So you could go here and then you can look for saaspod.com, for example, which is my company, and you will see that this domain is not available. However, saaspod.co.uk is available and other variations of it, but saaspod.com is not available, so you cannot use it. So make sure that the exact name of your podcast is available. You don't want to have variations of that, and you want to have a .com domain really, because that's a lot more powerful than other types of domains. For example, a niche down like .co.uk or an Australian one, because those will show up regionally a lot better than globally, and you want to have a global domain name, which is a .com domain name. And this will pretty much cover you in terms of making sure that your podcast name is unique. Make sure that you look on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, make sure that they don't have any podcasts that resemble your podcast in terms of names. Even if it's like slightly different, right? So for example, instead of the pod files is called the bot files or the pod documents or something like that, you don't want to come up with a name that is very close to their name. So just adding another letter or anything like that, it will not protect you for infringement. You could actually get into issues even though you slightly manipulated the way the name looks or the name sounds. So that's really, really important. So the third point I want to cover today is the branding opportunities you may miss if you don't name your podcast correctly. So for example, let's say you have a podcast name idea and you just put a podcast name, and then maybe you put that extension that I told you about, which will give you a little bit more visibility. But maybe adding the company brand in the name would be a good idea, or adding the host name in the brand. That may also be a good idea, especially if the host is well known. That could actually expose the podcast to the people that follow that particular person, or another thing, that person could actually create a personal brand, and his name or her name will show up on all the different platforms, and obviously Google will start learning about that person, and then you can trigger, for example, a knowledge panel, and then you can trigger more visibility to your brand, which is really, really important. If you want, I would advise that you add by, for example, SaaSpod, or with Adam Morgan, for example. You want to do that in order for you to capitalize on the name of your podcast. Adding a person or a company brand on the name may actually make it more unique, and at the same time will help the visibility of your podcast, or will help boost your personal or company brand. Now, another bonus tip I'm going to give you, and I'm not going to show you how to do it exactly, I'm just going to tell you about it, and if you want, you can research about it and do it, or you can wait for me to post a video, because I'm going to make another video on this. So make sure you subscribe to my channel so you can get notified when I actually upload this video. But one thing that you might want to do to further embed basically your authority on that podcast name, you might want to register that podcast name as an entity on a website such as Wikidata, for example. If I go here and search for the pod files, you will see that this is registered here as an entity. And what that does, it provides more context about what the podcast is, who is the host of the podcast, what business owns that podcast, in what country this podcast originates from, when it was launched. All these details that are really, really helpful, they are actually used by Google, for example, to create a knowledge panel for your podcast, or to organize the data into what we call a knowledge graph. And that will place your podcast name and give it context, basically. That's what it does. And then you can link this to another brand. For example, if the podcast is owned by, let's say, a company, you can link who is the company that owns that podcast, and it will really, really help creating logic around your name, and obviously give you more exposure in the process. I'm gonna tell you more about this. This is really, really interesting. I know that not a lot of people do this, especially on podcasting. They will not cover this. Most channels won't talk about it. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you found this YouTube video insightful and educational. If you did so, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you get more videos like this. And obviously give this video a like and leave comments down in the comment section, especially if you have a good podcast name that you already trademarked so other people are not going to nick it from you. But make sure that you comment down below your podcast name and the purpose behind your podcast name, the idea behind it. I would really like to learn more about you guys. So thank you so much and wish you a great day. Bye.